He flat out refused to sign the divorce papers for 6 months because he was secretly having her watched the entire time. Matteo Rinaldi doesn't just let his possessions go. When Giulia strutted into the lawyer's office, rocking a massive 7-month baby bump, she thought she held all the cards. But the tattooed mafia Don didn't even flinch. Instead, he kicked out the lawyers and gave her an ultimatum she couldn't refuse. You are not going back alone. You are coming home. Let us step into this scene together, you and I observing from the shadows of this cold Milan office. The lighting is harsh, built for bitter endings. At the mahogany table sits a lawyer, perspiration soaked collar his collar. He grips a silver pen like a lifeline. He is drowning in fish, and honestly, he should be. Over by the glass stands Matteo Rinaldi. Notice how the camera lingers on his stillness. Men of his violent pedigree never fidget. They use dead silence to suffocate the room. His back remains turned, allowing the dark ganging crawling up his neck to project absolute menace. The lesson here is written in blood. Never mistake a predator's quiet for peace. They are simply calculating the angle of the kill. The heavy letters, arms scarred across his knuckles, tell a tragic story of childhood trauma buried beneath decades of calculated cruelty. The camera holds on him. He remains completely frozen for 11 agonizing minutes. Then the heavy oak door clicks open. Watch his shoulders drop. We are looking at a ruthless mob boss who sleeps soundly after ordering executions. But the second Giulia steps into the lawn to draw the frame, his nervous system shatters. She drifts across the carpet with a haunting, tragic grace, wearing a heavy camel coat draped over a delicate ivory dress. Her face is an ice-cold mask of composure. But do not let the calm fool you. Look closely at the tension in her jaw. The quietest people in the room are always the ones carrying the heaviest, most desperate survival instincts. Watch her eyes in this tight close-up. She completely refuses to look at him, moving with slow deliberation to set her bag down. She smooths her coat, a desperate micro-movement to ground her violently trembling hands. When she finally lifts her chin into the light, the visual impact hits us like a physical blow. She is 7 months too pregnant. That ivory fabric clings to a heavy secret she somehow kept from a paranoid, controlling syndicate leader for nearly a year. Imagine the suffocating terror of hiding new life from a man who dictates death. Matteo finally turns from the window. You can almost hear his sick obsession with dominance shatter as his dark eyes drop to her stomach. You truly never understand how violently a bond breaks until you study how the trap was built. Let us dissolve the scene and jump back 18 months. Giulia had no suspicion she was walking blindly into a beautifully disguised nightmare. The setting is a high society masquerade in Florence. An ocean of absurd wealth masking rotten souls. She is nobody here, hiding in a borrowed blue dress, gripping a champagne flute to block out the aristocratic sneers. She retreats to a shadowed corner, pretending to study an oil painting. Suddenly, without a breath of warning, he's standing inches from her shoulder. Monsters like him do not make a sound when they stalk their prey. They wait until they have already breached your defenses. The lesson is vital. Always trust your instincts when the hair on your neck rises, because someone stepped too close in the dark. A man standing 6 feet 3 inches, tall, built like a wall, should not be able to sneak up on a shadow. He looks like a bare-knuckle brawler, violently forced into a custom Italian suit. Yet he wears those faded prison tattoos like medals of honor. That blatant disrespect for the room is pure arrogance. He leans close, his voice a low rumble, whispering that she is staring at the wrong painting. Giulia attempts to hold her ground. She refuses to give him her profile. fighting for a scrap of power. She murmurs that another canvas across the room holds more honest grief.
Then she makes the ultimate tragic mistake. She turns and looks him directly in the eyes.
His gaze is completely hollow, a freezing, pitch-black void under the warm chandelier light. Staring into those eyes is like me peering down into a freezing well. It is not overt aggression, which makes it far more terrifying. It is a vast, empty hunger. He introduces himself as Matteo, extending a massive hand stained with gang ink against every single alarm bell, screaming in her mind. She takes his hand and softly offers her name. His reaction is a slow, knowing smile as he whispers that he already knew exactly who she was. That is the chilling opening move of a practiced stalker. He launches an intense, suffocating pursuit, claiming her space as if he already owns her soul. He masks his obsession with grand, cinematic romance, buying out her favorite cafe, drowning her apartment in roses. Remember, the most dangerous cages are often painted to look like pure love. Listen closely, because you and I are going to dissect exactly how this toxic emotional snare closes. Matteo executes the oldest trick in the predator's playbook. He makes her feel like the center of the universe. Giulia is not foolish. Growing up in Milan, she knows his family controls the underworld. Yet, this man does not behave like a monster with her. He is intensely focused, asking deep, probing questions. But here is the cinematic tragedy. To him, this intimacy is merely data collection. He is patiently mapping her vulnerabilities bind her to him. The life lesson here is absolutely terrifying. True manipulation always feels exactly like a fairy tale at first. She falls in love just like falling asleep, slowly, then all at once. Fast forward 8 months, and the golden hanks snap shut. They marry at his isolated private estate. The camera contrasts her glowing white dress with his sharp black suit, making him look like the Grim Reaper collecting a soul. He even produces a single fake tear at the altar, an absolute masterclass in acting to seal her blind loyalty. For 4 months, she floats in a heavily guarded honeymoon illusion. Then, the velvet rots, dinners cancelled without a word, a ringing phone drains the color from the room. A locked study door she is forbidden to touch. Ruthless men arriving at 2 a.m. She knows she married the devil, but the lesson is cruel, knowing you are trapped in a nightmare. And finding the courage to run are 2 completely different things. The night the beautiful lie burns is a dead, quiet Wednesday in October. Giulia sits awake in the pitch-black kitchen. A window is cracked open, just enough to let the chill in Matteo's Jew's voice drift inside. He speaks in that hollow, bone-chilling register men of violence use when ordering a life erased. He murmurs to handle it and make sure nothing is found. She will never know whose blood watered the garden that night. Instead, her fragile mind retreats into denial. She forces herself to believe he was discussing a corporate merger. For 6 agonizing weeks, she lies to her own reflections just to survive the mornings. But the lesson remains absolute. You can never outrun the truth. The illusion shatters completely when a strange woman violently rattles the front leg gate. Focus on this venomous visitor. Dripping in aggressive luxury, she demands an audience with Matteo, demanding a dark swagger, proving she belongs in his blood-soaked world. Giulia approaches the iron gate. The woman slowly rakes her eyes over, from her plain gown down to her diamond wedding band, and smiles, a smile engineered to crush a human soul. She laughs, calling Giulia a pathetic temporary placeholder. It is a fatal wound. Giulia stumbles back in the kitchen, gasping for air as if the room is filling with water.
When the turns, she confronts him. He executes the ultimate toxic maneuver. He offers zero denial. He just stares does with those dead eyes and calls it complicated. The lesson?
A vague excuse is always the absolute loudest confession of guilt. He brushes her devastation aside, coldly instructing her to stop overreacting. But listen closely, because what he fails to say is what finally snaps the chains. He never promises the affair is over. He refuses to say he loves her. That chilling dismissal turns her into a ghost. On a freezing Sunday in January, she strikes. She planned this escape with the cold precision of an assassin. There are no screaming matches, no tearful begging for closure. She knows if she stops to cry, those tears will freeze into iron shackles. She packs one small suitcase. She leaves the heavy diamond ring resting on the granite counter, trading a fortune for a tiny slip of paper. The lesson is undeniable. Some absolute silence is the most devastating escape plan. You and I must look at that final letter. It contains no burning rage, just the freezing facts of a tragedy. Her elegant script reads, "I cannot be the person you need me to be in the life you have chosen. Goodbye." With one swift cut, she severs the rotten artery. But the agonizing irony of this film is she walked away completely blind to her own condition. 3 weeks later, a smiling nurse delivers the news, and Julia freezes in paralyzing horror. This is the climax, where two hearts shatter simultaneously. Matteo found his light, but let his darkness suffocate it, while Julia escaped the monster, only to carry his bloodline. The final lesson is brutal sometimes. Saving your own soul requires stepping into terrifying isolation. True freedom often demands a violently heavy price. Picture this opening shot with me. We are watching Julia carefully moving chess pieces while her opponent blindly plays with fire. She calculates every shadow, bracing for the fallout. Hiding her pregnancy from a crime boss was not an act of malice. It was the raw instinct of a mother trying to survive. She simply needed his signature on those divorce papers so she could finally breathe. People often use their children as pawns in a breakup, but she rejects that entirely. Trapping him would only build a new cage in the exact same prison. Instead, she escapes to a sunlit room in Turin, making art just to hold the darkness back. You and I can see the lesson right here. The smartest thing you can ever do is build your own solid foundation before you let anyone else walk across it. Picture the opening shot of this beautiful, irreversible tragedy. We find Julia, 5 months pregnant, moving like a chess master through a room full of amateurs. She spent half a year building a lifeboat out of solid steel, sitting next to a divorce lawyer whose blood runs ice cold. For 6 months, her underworld husband Matteo brushed off the separation as a joke. Now, the lens catches him frozen by the window. The harsh daylight hits his knuckles as they turn bone white against the heavy mahogany desk. He is a tyrant, suddenly realizing his iron chains have snapped. It is a complete, silent portrait of power-changing hands. Real freedom always requires cutting away the invisible ropes that tie you to a captor. Even when your own hands bleed from holding the knife, you can practically feel the air bleeding right out of the room. Matteo locks his eyes on her in the dim light, tracking her breathing like a wounded wolf, deciding where to bite. But Julia remains carved from solid rock. She smooths the fabric of her coat, freezing him out, and tells the lawyer to start. Matteo does not scream. He does not shatter a glass or flip the heavy desk. He uses the dead silence as a weapon, suffocating the room just by standing there. In the background, his enforcer Enzo shifts on his feet, trapped between mafia loyalty and a heavy, crushing guilt. It is a terrifying truth about battling a predator. Total silence is never just empty space. When the person holding the weapon goes completely quiet, they are simply taking aim. Look closely at Enzo standing in the shadows. He used to be the only soul in this violent crime family who treated Julia like a human being. Now, his eyes dropped to her softly rounded stomach, the devastating math playing out on his face. Suddenly, the rookie attorney shatters the quiet, barking a foolish demand at the boss about the child. Matteo lowers his voice to a raspy whisper. A scream in this underworld means anger, but a whisper means someone is measuring a coffin. The lawyer keeps pushing, totally blind to the explosive wire he just tripped. Let this be a grim lesson for survival. When you find yourself standing in front of a starving lion, demanding immediate answers will only make you the prey. Notice the silent psychological war happening right in this frame. Julia hides the wild hammering of her heart behind a mask of pure ice. She slides her gaze right past her terrifying husband and coldly declares the child is completely out of his reach. Matteo physically recoils. His heavy voice drops her name like an iron anvil against the wood. As Julia tells her lawyer to move on, a wretched, suffocating gasp escapes the crime boss. It is the agonizing sound of a tyrant physically choking on his own sudden lack of power. He sinks into his leather chair, a portrait of dark gravity collapsing under its own heavy weight. It is a miserable but necessary truce to accept. Anyone who is used to ruling your spirit will always treat a simple, healthy boundary as an act of total treason. Matteo flattens his voice into a dead, chilling frequency. It is the exact tone you hear right before the violence starts. He calculates the bitter math out loud, accusing her of hiding his unborn heir the very day she ran away. Julia refuses to play into his theatrical sadness. She meets his hollow eyes and quietly states she only discovered the life inside us is after she escaped. The air in the room grows so heavy you could cut it with a knife. The attorney suddenly stares at his shaking pen, while Enzo turns into a breathing statue. The fallen king loops the timeline obsessively, unable to accept his defeat. It is an ironclad rule to carry with you. You will slowly lose your mind, trying to reason with someone who is deeply in love with their own comforting lies. Stick with me here, because we need to linger on this exact frame. This is the split second Julia finally shatters her chains. She looks into the eyes of the man who used to own her, calmly stating she needed time to decide if he even deserved to know his child. For a fleeting beat, the iron-willed criminal actually cracks. His deep voice splinters before he wrestles it back into the dark. She stares at the ruthless killer she once bled to save, entirely erasing his massive ego from the story. She speaks only of what her baby needs, making his demands completely invisible. It is a profound awakening. True healing never starts when you finally fix the person who broke you. It begins the moment you stop trying to save the fire and just pull the innocent out of the flames. The silence stretches out as Matteo chokes down his defeat. He stands up, blocking out the daylight, and orders the lawyers out of the room. When the rookie hesitates, Matteo drops the temperature to absolute frost. He tells them to leave right now. Julia gives her lawyer a slight nod, and her human shields vanish. Only Enzo remains in the shadows. But Julia does not flinch. She presses her hands against the cool mahogany desk, staring down the dark reflection of her ex-husband in the window glass. He whispers to the cold glass, asking if the blood is truly his. She answers with a rock-solid yes. It is a terrifying climax to the scene, carrying an undeniable truth. Sometimes, the only way to beat the monster in the dark is to plant your feet and stare directly into its hollow eyes. The reaction hits like a gunshot. Matteo spins around, violently tearing the dead air apart, crossing the floor until his massive shadow swallows her entirely. It is a primitive scare tactic, designed to make her flinch and back down. but the camera shows us his broken posture. He stands like a marble statue, yet his eyes are sunken deep into exhausted, hollow pits. The dark ink climbing up his throat only highlights how sick and pale he looks. Here is a crime boss who demands to rule the entire earth, yet losing one single woman is rotting him from the inside out. It is a visually striking lesson on the illusion of power. Absolute control is a total ghost. If you grip the world too hard, your own bones are the very first things that will break under the pressure. For one agonizing second, the ghosts of Julia's old devotion come rushing back. She watches the physical decay of the man standing in front of her, and a tragic ripple of pity crosses her face. But the illusion shatters. She knows his grief is not coming from a broken heart. He is just mourning the loss of a prized possession. He whispers about his unborn son, his voice breaking as he swears he would have protected her. A shaking hand reaches out, hanging in the cold air, unable to cross the ruins he built himself. She stares at his hovering fingers, feeling a quiet sorrow. It exposes the most dangerous trap in human nature. Just because a wounded wolf cries in the freezing snow does not mean it will hesitate to tear you apart when the deep hunger comes back. Let us unpack this defensive move together. She looks right into his eyes and states that his suffocating control is the exact reason she buried the truth. Over by the door, Enzo turns to the wall, unable to watch his untouchable boss get taken apart by a pregnant mother. Slowly, Matteo pulls his hand back. The camera lingers as he swallows a volcanic surge of poison, using the terrifying discipline of a hardened criminal. In a heartbeat, the wounded lover is gone, replaced by the cold interrogator. He names Turin as her hiding spot, a fact he pulled from his dark network. Julia does not even blink at the stalking. Real peace is never about finding a place where shadows cannot reach. It is about learning to walk through the dark without letting the monsters break your stride. Julia tries to bring logic back to the room, discussing her new life as if this were a standard legal dispute. Matteo destroys that illusion in a single breath. He tells her, without a drop of warmth, that Turin is completely out of the question. The lighting feels colder as he drops the hammer, showing zero rage, just the absolute finality of a dictator laying down the law. He will never allow his heir to live outside his territory. Legal papers mean nothing to a man who lives above the law. In his twisted mind, he is just collecting a stolen asset. It is a sickening revelation, but a vital lesson for anyone facing darkness. Extreme toxicity never sees you as an equal human being. They only see you as a misplaced object that needs to be dragged right back into the cage. Let us pause the frame here. Matteo points his defiance like a loaded revolver, pressing his hands. Thus, he denies her, sir. He then drops a psychological grenade, murmuring a dark invitation for her to come home. The words are engineered to resurrect her trauma bond. Yet Julia sees the poison. She holds the predator's gaze and denies him. When he feigns gentleness, claiming it was just a question, she shatters the facade. You are not asking, she says softly. You are instructing. This scene is a brilliant study in survival, leaving us with a haunting life lesson. The most dangerous form of control never looks like a physical prison. Sometimes, the absolute cruelest cage you will ever step into is perfectly disguised as a lover's warm and inviting embrace. Look closely at the framing in this shot. The shadows press inward as Julia names the ghost between them, that fateful garden conversation where the blood of his empire seeped into their marriage. Matteo shifts his weight, his voice smooth, weaving his usual dark web of denial. But she severs the thread entirely. Heavy with child, she pushes herself up, her trembling hand resting on the wood. Take the offer, she commands. Yet as she turns to leave, he steps directly into the doorway. He becomes an immovable wall of tailored suits and silent authority, blocking her only exit. The life lesson here is absolute. You can never wait for the architect of your own prison to kindly hand you the keys. True freedom demands that you use your shaking legs and walk out the door yourself. You and I need to examine Matteo's gravity in this frame. Notice the rigid line of his shoulders as he positions himself between his wife and the hallway. He leaves a physical gap, yet his presence pulls every ounce of oxygen from the room. You look exhausted, he murmurs. The lighting catches a dangerous softening in his eyes as he weaponizes affection. Julia is braced for his signature rage, but instead, he drowns her in manufactured empathy. Her jaw clenches, locking her face into a mask of pure survival. "Let me take you to lunch," he breathes, dropping the invitation like a heavy ang. The tragedy carries a brutal life lesson. When someone holding all the power invites you to sit at their table, it is never a polite request. It is an inescapable command wrapped in velvet. The camera lingers on his hands. The dark ink on his knuckles shifts as he grips the wood with restrained violence. His gaze sweeps over her, cataloging every vulnerability. "You need to eat," he dictates, leaving zero room for debate. She lifts her chin, her voice trembling but defiant, warning him that a meal will not change her mind. Then Matteo drops the floor out from under her. "I know," he whispers, under this tragic truth. When a predator admits defeat, he is not waving a white flag. He is merely repositioning his weapons. Julia exhales, her defenses slipping just a fraction to grant him 1 hour. "Just us," he purrs. The life lesson is written in her quiet surrender. Never sacrifice a single hour of your future to someone who has already devoured the best years of your past. The tragedy of Julia is that she sees the snare. She knows isolation is the core of a trauma bond. Those 2 words, "just us," are a siren song. Yet the pull of their ruined romance drags her back into the dark. The director frames them in a dimly lit restaurant, shielding his empire from prying eyes. Watch how he orchestrates the scene, claiming the corner booth and ordering her water without a glance at the menu. He perfectly recalls her aversions. To an outsider, he is a fiercely devoted husband. But the camera exposes a chilling display of dominance, proving she remains under his watchful eye. The life lesson cuts deep. Genuine love will always offer you a real choice. Control makes every decision for you, expecting you to smile gracefully from inside your beautifully locked cage. Let's take a closer look at Matteo's terrifying duality. His mind operates like a cold filing cabinet, retaining every preference his wife ever had. Early on, this obsessive focus masqueraded as romance. Now it reveals itself as surveillance. He asks about the baby, his tone clinical, extracting intel. "Normal," she replies, refusing to bleed for him.
Without a word, he places a piece of bread on her plate. It is a hauntingly domestic action born from years of conditioning. The phantom limb of their dead marriage is still twitching on the table.
She feels the violation but swallows her words. The silence holds a painful life lesson. Sometimes the ghosts of our comfortable old habits are far harder to outrun than the actual monsters we finally managed to leave behind. The cinematography is grim as he interrogates her new life in Turin. The dim light catches the harsh ink on his neck. Even draped in expensive wool, he radiates the low-frequency hum of pure violence. He is a starving wolf sitting patiently at the table. As the camera pushes in on Julia, we witness a tragic internal collapse. Her eyes glisten because she has missed him every single day. This is the absolute tragedy of a trauma bond, her nervous system screaming for the hands that shattered it. She digs her nails into her palms to anchor her reality, recognizing the ache as mere chemical withdrawal. The life lesson is profound. Missing the person who broke you does not mean you made a mistake by walking away. It simply means your heart is surviving the withdrawal and starting to heal. You and I can see the tectonic plates shifting here. Matteo quietly demands to be in the room when their child is born, weaponizing the boundaries she built. Watch his micro-expressions, a chilling of psychological warfare. His cold armor melts away, replaced by the bleeding vulnerability of a desperate father. It is terrifying to witness. A true predator knows exactly when to let an authentic tear fall to inflict maximum emotional damage. Julia's breath catches. She sees the phantom of the man she loved, and it paralyzes her logic. She looks away, unable to merge this weeping father with the monster from her memories. The life lesson is vital for survival. It's a single moment of genuine, tearful pain from a toxic person never washes away the years of wreckage they left behind. The camera shows the city outside, blind to the psychological bloodbath at this table. "I will think about it," Julia whispers. He nods, a perfectly executed performance of restraint. A heavy silence settles. In this pause, you can almost see the dangerous illusion wrapping its arms around her. Her bruised youth begs to pretend this man is just a misunderstood husband. But survival requires vigilance. Her knuckles turn white as she grips the wood, brick by brick, rebuilding her shattered walls. She leans forward, staring straight into the dark abyss of his eyes. There is something you should know," she murmurs. The life lesson rings loud and clear when the silence then starts to feeling a little too comfortable with a monster. You must find the courage to finally make some noise. We watch the futility of explaining emotional starvation to a true megalomaniac. Her voice trembles as she confesses her escape was never just about the blood in the garden. It was the suffocating pressure of living inside his twisted mind. She articulates the tragedy of loving a man who worships his own shadow. "I felt like a room in your house," she whispers.
Beautifully decorated, but permanently locked behind headers the truth deeper, explaining that his burning need to protect her is indistinguishable from his need to imprison her.
For him, love and domination are exact synonyms. Matteo turns to stone, his muscles locking up against the table. The life lesson is etched into this devastation. A golden cage is always a prison, no matter how obsessively they polish the bars. The dark ink on his skin pulls taut as the weight of a word's lands. The scene delivers a psychological earthquake. "You are right," he murmurs into the shadows. He stares at his hands, confessing his tragic flaw. He cannot distinguish between emotional intimacy and a tactical defense strategy. "I handled you," he admits softly. Let that sterile, terrifying word echo for a moment. Handled. He finally applies the cold vocabulary of his underworld to the woman he loves. He never saw a wife. He saw a beautiful liability requiring constant risk management. The heavy silence filling the room is the sound of his delusion shattering. The life lesson here is chilling. You can never build a warm home with a man whose only skill is constructing military fortresses. Stick with me here, because his entire defense is about to collapse. She watches him, demanding to know what triggered this sudden self-awareness. He gestures toward her pregnant stomach. The camera lingers on his exhausted eyes as he admits he ordered his men to track her every move. "You had me stalked," she states, tearing away his romantic facade. He leans forward and, clinging to the delusion that his surveillance is devotion. There is a difference," he begs, his voice cracking. "There really is not," she replies, her gaze turning to pure ice. For the first time, The crime boss does not fight back. "I know," he whispers. The lesson here is terrifyingly clear. If a man must spy on your shadow to feel secure, he does not love you. He simply wants to own you entirely. Let us hit pause and study her desperate escape. 2 days later, she bolts back to Turin, plunging her legal team into the dark. Picture the haunting cinematography on that train. She sits by the window, arms wrapped fiercely around her stomach, whispering promises to her unborn child. Trauma survivors know this physical response perfectly well. You cling to the nearest anchor. "He is never what I expect," she murmurs to her reflection. That sentence is the absolute trap. Unpredictability is the superglue of a toxic bond, hooking your brain on the adrenaline of the unknown. Finally, she reaches the sunlit sanctuary of her friend Serena, a warm contrast to the cold mafia underworld. It leaves us with a beautiful truth. Sometimes, the strongest armor you can wear against a nightmare is the open door of one genuinely good friend. Let us look at this piece by piece, shall we? The camera opens on Serena. She does not flinch. The second Julia crosses the threshold, Serena demands the unvarnished truth. Julia sighs, confessing the impossible. Her husband is acting entirely out of character. The crime boss actually delivered a real apology instead of his usual venomous blame. That kind of emotional whiplash will completely shatter your peace of mind. Serena sits in cold silence as Julia says he confessed to treating her like a mere transaction. We must recognize the tragic irony here. When the person who broke your spirit suddenly adopts the soft language of healing, they are usually just slipping on a far more dangerous mask. The truth is simple. An apology without changed behavior is just manipulation wearing a nice suit. Serena goes dead silent. In a room this heavy, that quiet speaks louder than a scream. She asks the one question that cuts to the bone: does Julia actually believe his act? Julia dissects his motives like a cold experiment. She thinks he believes his own lies right now, but self-deception cannot mend a ruined soul. Serena brutally turns the mirror back toward her friend. It is never about whether the villain can find redemption, but whether you are willing to burn in his fire while he tries. 3 days bleed by before the illusion of safety shatters. A nameless number flashes on her phone. She answers, and a strange voice slithers through the speaker. It is a sobering lesson. You can run far away, but until you says the tie completely, your dark past will always hunt down your new address. Pay close attention to asterisks. The caller knows exactly to use fear, casually dropping the mafia name. She sacrificed everything to escape. Watch how Julia's knuckles turn a desperate white, panic hammering against her ribs. "Who is this?" she demands, her voice trembling. The stranger just purrs, playing the role of a polite friend. The second she rejects him, the velvet gloves come off. He coldly reminds her that the innocent child growing inside her carries the family blood, turning her baby into a valuable piece on the board. The blood in her veins turns to frost. She orders him away and slams the phone down. Pretending the wolf is gone will never save you. The hardest lesson is that ignoring our deepest problems only gives them time to sharpen their teeth in the shadows. She sits in the dim room, paralyzed by shock. Acting on the tragic instincts of our battered survivor, she dials the monster she bled to escape. Matteo answers on the first ring. "I have been waiting for you," he breathes. When she chokes out the details of the threat, the line goes quiet. It is the bone-chilling pause of an apex predator locking onto a scent. He demands answers. She describes the stranger and his rough drawl. The ensuing quiet is devoid of mercy. When Matteo speaks her name, the wounded husband facade evaporates. Out steps the ruthless kingpin, the suzerain of violence. she once heard ordering deaths in the dark. This is a grim, grim warning. You can dress a man in soft apologies, but when real danger strikes, his truest, violent nature will always tear right through the disguise. His tone is unforgiving iron now, demanding her absolute surrender. He commands her to return to Milan this instant. When she pushes back, watch the masterclass in psychological warfare unfold. He instantly shifts into the protective hero. If they have your number, he warns and softly, your sanctuary is already compromised. A visceral panic sets in. Her trembling hand falls to shield her swollen belly. Who are these men? She pleads. His hesitation is truly terrifying. He confesses they are rivals hunting for a weakness to exploit, forces he has failed to crush for months. This lays bare a devastating flaw in powerful men. They will risk absolute ruin before admitting they have lost their grip on the wheel. Control is merely a fragile illusion. Fighting desperately to maintain it almost always ends up destroying the very souls we claim to cherish. Follow closely, for a manipulator only offers the truth when it serves as a weapon. Julia asks if this is the bloody chaos he handles in the shadows. For the first time, he does not deflect. He begs her to return. Right on cue, the child kicks inside her, as if feeling the gravity of her surrender. She breaks. The next morning, a black sedan glides to the curb. Matteo did not send muscle. Enzo steps out offering fresh coffee and an aura of unnerving calm. This is precisely how the cage locks. Enzo acts as the gentle face of a nightmare, wrapping insane syndicate violence in a blanket of normalcy. The lesson here will chill your blood. The most dangerous threats rarely come screaming. More often, they are quietly pouring you a warm cup of coffee while the house burns down around your feet. Look closely at Serena, who packs her bags without a second thought. Enzo offers no protest, perfectly exposing the sheer desperation bleeding out of Matteo. The long ride toward Milan is cascaded by silence. Serena drifts off, but Enzo drives with the rigid focus of a soldier in hostile territory. Julia stares through the tinted glass, entirely numb. Then Enzo's soft voice pierces the quiet, dropping a heavy detail, but Matteo stayed up until 4 in the morning, personally securing the perimeter for her. You do not need to tell me that, she snaps. But the seed is planted. The faithful lieutenant chips away at her armor, feeding her the illusion of the monster's devotion. This is a tragic reality. We constantly mistake toxic for genuine love, willingly picking up the heavy chains to lock ourselves back to the hands that broke us. Let us unpack the hard ride together, because what you and I are watching is pure psychological warfare. Enzo sits there, his voice smooth as glass. Admitting he tracked Julia in Turin from the beginning, he smoothly spins the stalking, framing himself as a shield in the dark. It is the same toxic rationale Matteo uses. Yet because the killer is polite, Julia feels her anger slipping. She confesses her desperate need for safety. Enzo actually validates her fear, swearing he has never seen Matteo drowning in such agonizing guilt. This reveals how desperately we crave validation, even from those who hurt us. When an adversary acknowledges our pain, our heavy walls naturally fall. But we must remember a simple truth. Someone pointing out your bleeding does not mean they will drop the knife. A common manipulator offers a cheap apology before blaming you for the fallout. Yet Matteo seems genuinely buried under the wreckage of his choices. Julia keeps her expression blank, her hand instinctively guarding her unborn child as they enter the estate. This is a fortress, is his controlling mind constructed from solid stone and freezing shadows. After 6 months of freedom, she expected this property to feel foreign. But when the scent of polished stone hits her lungs, her racing heart dangerously slows. It brings a sickening wave of comfort, highlighting the tragedy of a toxic bond. When you survive in the dark for years, stepping back into the shadows feels like a warm embrace. In life, we often make the fatal mistake of confusing a familiar cage with a genuinely safe home. Matteo lingers in the gloom of the grand foyer. A boss cannot dare pediment, as that means surrendering dominance. He waits by the stairs, his dark tattoos fully exposed. His gaze locks onto her face, then drops to her pregnancy. A look of terrifying ownership flashes across his features. "Thank you for coming," he murmurs. "I did not return for you," she fires back, trying to build a quick, emotional wall. "I came for my child." "Our child," he corrects her in a velvet whisper, effortlessly taking the weapon from her hands. He mentions setting up the east bedroom, surgically avoiding the word yours. It is a devastating power play. A brilliant predator knows exactly how much leash to offer. Giving someone the beautiful illusion of choice is often to ensure they never truly walk away. "You remembered I prefer the eastern light," she says. "I remember everything," he replies, his tone flat. "We have to look closely at this trap together." Weaponizing small details makes someone feel profoundly seen, wrapping them in a counterfeit sense of worth. Later, a silent dinner is served. Afterward, he simply asks her to take a walk. It is a gentle request, not a brutal command, handing her the intoxicating illusion of choice. They drift into the shadowy garden. He maintains a respectful distance, shedding his physical dominance like an old skin. It is a terrifying evolution of control. "Tell me about the threat," she demands, willingly marching right into his waiting jaws. The hardest cage to break is always the one we lock ourselves inside, entirely convinced we are holding the key. Let us pause the frame right here. Watch this untouchable mastermind confess his fatal flaw. A rival discovered that Matteo's true weakness is not his vast territory or wealth. It is Julia. The tragic part is that Matteo looks her in the eyes and completely agrees. He strips away the bravado, delivering the cold reality that he would gladly burn his entire empire to ash just to keep her safe. It is a deeply twisted devotion, yet it strikes a heavy emotional chord. Here stands a ruthless ruler who solves every problem with violence, paralyzed by his affection. The lesson here is quiet but profound. The massive walls we build to keep the dangerous world out at almost always end up trapping us inside with our softest vulnerabilities. Even in the darkest hearts, love makes a hostage of us all. The camera pushes in on Julia, standing alone in the bitter frost. Months ago, she fled this estate, swearing she would never let him near her again. Now, the moonlight catches her sharp exhale as that absolute certainty turns to ash. You can see the exact frame where the toxic bond hooks its claws back into her mind. Her hands tremble against her heavy coat. Terrified of her own quiet surrender, she bolts for the house, reacting just like any of us would. Matteo Voss remains in the freezing dark, watching her run, promising a war for tomorrow. This brings us to a harsh, inescapable truth. The most terrifying thing is the monster waiting for you in the cold dark. It is sudden, sickening realization that a small part of you actually wants the monster to catch you. Let us hold on this frame to take in the agonizing irony. Julia lingers on the heavy oak threshold, whispering a quiet thank you for putting their child first. She is fighting the intense magnetic pull between them. As she steps back into the cage, she risked everything to shatter. Matteo stays rooted in the frost. The harsh amber light catches the faded loyalty tattoo on his neck. For 20 years, that ink meant bleeding for his crime family. Now, his entire worldview is fracturing behind those dark eyes. He is the shield guarding her from the wolves, but he remains the warden holding the heavy iron keys. The lesson here cuts incredibly deep. True loyalty is not about taking a bullet. Real love is having the agonizing strength to let someone walk away when you know that keeping them will only break them. Cut to 3 a.m. The bedroom is swallowed in suffocating shadows. The fragile illusion of peace Julia built shatters instantly. She wakes to the rapid-fire snap of shouted Italian drifting up from the freezing courtyard. Her eyes dart to the window as she recognizes the clinical rhythm of syndicate soldiers rushing to plug a security breach. She curls inward, her trembling fingers instinctively shielding her stomach. She is paralyzed by the horrific fact that the violent war has literally bled onto her doorstep. The camera lingers on her wide, terrified eyes, teaching us an unforgiving reality about trauma. You simply cannot heal in the exact same environment that broke you in the first place, no matter how thick the stone walls are or how many armed guards patrol the gates. You and I have to look closely at what she does next. Her body takes over entirely. There is no conscious thought, just a visceral trauma response driving her. She pulls a heavy robe over her shoulders and slips toward the window, hiding in the velvet shadows. Below, the courtyard is drowning in chaos. A guard frantically flashes a grainy photograph while a sweating lieutenant delivers catastrophic news. After 30 seconds of watching this unfold, Julia discards every boundary she fought so hard to build. She marches directly down to the ground floor study, her bare feet silent on the cold marble. It reveals a brutal truth about human survival. Fear might teach us the rules of the game, but when your very existence is threatened, you will shatter every single rule without a second thought. The camera sweeps into the dim study, finding Matteo bathed in the harsh glow of desk lamps. His jacket is off, sleeves pushed up to reveal the dark ink on his arms. The old boy would have ordered her back upstairs to play the obedient wife. Definitely letting her approach the desk to stare at the scattered, grainy surveillance photos. The image shows her old apartment lobby in Turin. A syndicate operative was inside her supposedly safe building. Matteo is no longer shielding her from the terror. This reminds us of a terrifying truth about toxic control. True power is not always about micromanaging someone's life. Sometimes it is about stepping back and letting the brutal outside world convince a person that they desperately need you to survive. The lighting shifts, casting hollow shadows across Julia's face as her stomach drops. Matteo is unnervingly calm, revealing those photos were taken mere hours after she fled. Then, her eyes lock onto a blurred figure near the elevator in the printouts. It is her best friend, Serena. A raw panic spikes in her chest. But Matteo steps in smoothly, extinguishing the terror with a single sentence. He casually notes his men have already secured Serena and are bringing her to the estate. He anticipated the rival strike and perfectly positioned himself as the ultimate savior. You boys need this dark reality. Those dangerous predators do not drag you kicking into a cage. They simply make the outside world so deadly that you willingly walk inside and lock the heavy iron door yourself. You and I need to unpack the beautifully twisted psychology unfolding thing right here. Matteo leans his weight onto heavy desk. The golden lamplight catches the dark ink creeping up his forearm. He explains an absolutely horrific situation with the chilling calm of a man simply ordering an espresso. He tells Julia that out in Turin, she was a perfect target for Duca. But inside these walls, she is surrounded by 30 men who would swallow a bullet before letting a stranger near the front door. It sounds flawlessly logical, right? Yet beneath that gentle tone lies a masterclass in psychological isolation, quietly severing her from the outside world entirely. It brings us to a harsh but meaningful reality. True manipulation rarely holds a knife to your throat. Most of the time, it arrives offering a heavily guarded fortress to keep you safe. He tries playing his ultimate card. His voice drops as he reminds Julia she is his wife, the woman carrying his heir. He pins her with a heavy stare designed to make anyone unravel. But the camera stays locked on Julia. She straightens her spine, steps back from his gravitational pull, and demands the actual tactical plan. She is fighting off a deep trauma bond in real time. Surprisingly, the arrogant kingpin pivots. He drops his condescending armor and speaks to her like an equal, mapping out how Durka is bleeding his northern territory dry. It leaves us with a painful truth. Real growth always demands we drop our defenses. But for a seasoned criminal mastermind, even brutal honesty is just another calculated weapon. The lens focuses on the tragic rot at the core of syndicate life. Matteo clenches his jaw, confessing he once handled bloody turf wars by tossing away small scraps of territory. But criminal greed has no ceiling. Duca wants the entire northern network, and when Matteo refused, the rival lie aimed directly at Julia. Self-hatred flashes in his eyes as he admits his biggest failure. He's only now forming an alliance with 3 rival families, a move he delayed simply because his suffocating ego could not stomach asking for help. It leaves us with a very clear, grounded lesson. When the stakes are life and death, an inflated ego is a fatal vulnerability. You either get to protect your fragile pride, or you get to protect your actual life. You never get to keep both. We have to admire Julia in this exact moment. She does not miss a single beat. She stares into the eyes of this terrifying boss and plainly states that his ridiculous pride almost got her murdered. A typical narcissist would explode into rage, but Matteo just takes the hit. He offers a cold nod, testing a completely new psychological strategy. For a split second, they share a ghost of a smile over how fractured their shared reality is. She glances down at his scarred knuckles, asking what her role is now. He simply tells her to stay safe while he handles the blood outside. It teaches us a profound lesson about human nature. A deeply flawed person can easily tell you the honest truth, provided that truth perfectly serves their own selfish endgame.
Less gymnastics here, staggering. Locked her weight, suffocating dominance.
Now, he packages the isolation, a pragmatic division of labor. He manages the violence outside while she keeps their baby safe inside. He insists it is just logical resource management, but Julia sees through the cracks. It is the exact same primal, obsessive possession, just dressed up in a tailored suit. The heavy, silent gaze of Matteo actually agrees with her. She almost reaches out to touch his face, pulling her hand back at the last second. It leaves us with a heartbreaking, essential lesson. No matter how much shiny gold you paint on the heavy iron bars, an upgraded cage is still a cage. Instead of surrendering to a romantic climax, Julia shuts the emotional valve entirely. Her voice is ice as she tells the feared boss to get some sleep so he can be tactically useful. Matteo remains frozen behind the desk, his impenetrable armor completely stripped away. She walks out, leaving him to drown in the crushing weight of his crumbling empire. By morning, the heavy doors swing open. Serena is marched inside, radiating the fury of a civilian dragged into a bloody syndicate war. Over a tense breakfast, Julia breaks her silence, laying bare the brutal reality of the underworld.
It brings us to a powerful realization
About relationships.
keeping dark
secrets is exactly what keeps a toxic dynamic breathing. The second you drag the ugly truth into the harsh sunlight, the illusion finally dies. Let us pause and look at this together. Serena stands in the estate, the marble columns looming like prison bars. She looks at this opulent cage and instantly names the poison. Julia is still hopelessly tethered to the kingpin. Lowering her head, Julia confesses to the invisible pull, silencing her survival instincts. Serena speaks in a devastating truth. Human attachment survives without a single drop of logic. Julia tries building a defense, scarved as carelessness, neglect, the same deep scars as his violence. Serena delivers the fatal question. Has this man truly changed his soul? The takeaway is absolute. Excusing the person who breaks you is the first chain of captivity. We cling to the phantom of who they could be, blinding ourselves to the harsh reality standing in front of us. The camera pushes in on Julia sitting in the silence. The tissue weighs fragmented evidence, replaying the moment the boss lowered his guard. A tragic hope flickers. She almost believes the monster is tamed. Then, her trembling hand drifts to her stomach. Feeling the flutter of her unborn, her darkest terror spills out. She fears his gentle act is just a temporary mask. Matteo is boxed in by rivals and her pregnancy. He plays the vulnerability card only because his usual violence cannot win this war. Serena forces her to face the truth. The lesson is written in blood. Temporary surrender is never a permanent cure. Real transformation does not when the predator is cornered. True change only happens when they hold absolute power and still choose mercy. Julia stares into the distance, stripped of defense. Building trust from betrayal requires us time they lack, days into her captivity. Matteo summons a massive council. Watch Julia closely here. She stands her ground, drawing an unbreakable line. She refuses to step inside that suffocating room, knowing observing a venomous world from the outside is better than letting it drag you under. For 4 agonizing hours, she listens to the guttural roars of violent men echoing through the oak doors. When silence falls, Matteo seeks her out. He collapses into a chair, stripping away his armor. He leans forward, tattooed arms on his knees, staring at the floor like a broken man. This reveals a profound truth. Setting a strict boundary is never about trying to name a chaotic force. It is simply about building an iron fortress to protect your own peace. The lighting is stark as Matteo confesses the brutal ultimatum he delivered. Duca must accept the borders he despises, or the coalition will tear him to pieces. Julia studies his face, recognizing a bitter truth. Men poisoned by a god complex do not wish to die. They push their luck until reality shatters their teeth. Duca hunting Julia was just the pathetic thrashing of a collapsing ego. Yet she knows a cornered man is capable of horrors. Matteo nods, sharing the terrifying realization. 30 armed enforcers will surround the estate until the blood treaty is signed. She remains still, tracing her book, fighting to stay anchored. Here is the tragic lesson we must face. Genuine safety is never found by trusting the promises of a cornered predator. It is only secure when you hold the iron key to their cage. Let us look at this frame by frame. When Julia gathers the courage to stay, she must return to Turin. The kingpin does not flinch. He stares into her eyes and softly whispers, "I know." The room goes entirely silent. He lowers his voice, engineering his tone to sound as if her departure is tearing his heart in two. He promises he will not force her to stay. It is a terrifying performance. He disguises a command as a painful sacrifice, is painting his past tyranny as an act of protection. The lesson here is harsh. You must never confuse a captor loosening the leash with actual freedom. The tragedy of a hostage is that Eventually, the heart begs to believe the warden is a savior. A sickening certainty settles in her stomach. Then he springs the velvet trap. He asks if she might move to Milan when the child is born, not in his fortress, but just close enough. Notice how he wraps his request in calculated vulnerability, offering her a city apartment to build a perfect illusion of independence. Like a seasoned actor, his voice breaks. He whispers that he just wants to be near enough to see the small moments.
The dark ink on his throat
Shifts as he swallows, reminding her he already missed 6 months of the pregnancy. He drops a crushing weight of guilt right on her shoulders. This reveals a tragic truth. The most inescapable cages are always the ones we willingly lock ourselves inside. Heavy silence stretches out, breaking only when she murmurs that she will think about it. It is the exact phrase she used at the divorce office, and in that quiet moment, you can almost hear the cold iron wind snapping right back onto her wrist. Bleak light washes over the estate. For trauma survivors, simple morning rituals are often the only tether to sanity. She paces the gravel paths, letting the biting wind clear her mind. It reminds us of a hard truth. Our clearest revelations usually surface only when we force ourselves into the uncomfortable cold. Suddenly, his massive frame fills the doorway. The pale light traces the violent history tattooed across its arms, projecting dominance. It is finished, he tells the empty air, though she shows no relief, because an underworld king never lets himself look afraid. Still, his rigid shoulders drop a fraction of an inch. Julia instantly deflects the heavy tension by asking about Serena. He replies with chilling casualness that her friend is entirely free to go. A fragile laugh escapes her lips, an emotional fracture that stuns them both. He stares at her, his face stripped of its lethal edge. For one heartbeat, he wears the same tender look from their wedding day. It is a brief slip before his cold defenses snap back. She swallows the bitter laugh, staring at the crunching raw. "I am going to go home soon," she whispers, gripping her crumbling shield. This confronts us with a vital truth. Real boundaries must be forged from solid steel in your soul long before they crossed your lips. "I know," he replies, his voice like dark velvet. She looks up, her breath catching. He has already erased the physical distance between them. He towers in her personal space, pulling a calculated move that makes the rest of the world vanish. The ink on his throat rests inches from her eyes, a silent monument to his dominion. "I have something to say," he murmurs, seizing control of the scene. He begs her to simply listen and not build a fortress in her mind. Watch how flawlessly he dismantles her psychological armor. This brings us to a vital life lesson. Anyone who asks you to drop your critical thoughts is secretly preparing to pull your strings. She freezes, locked in the stillness of hunted prey, and weakly agrees to listen. He draws a heavy breath. His twitching fingers betray a violent urge to pull her against him. "When I stood at that window," he begins, "I want to be honest. Everything went dead quiet." He perfectly describes the chilling detachment of a monster calmly preparing to burn the world to ashes. You and I need to pay close attention here. We are watching a masterclass in how a shattered soul justifies his own ruin. He stares into her eyes, declaring he finally recognizes his failure. He claims his mistake was creating a world where leaving him was her only logical choice. It is a breathtaking illusion of accountability. He paints himself as a torment king who only wanted to keep his queens safe, admitting that standing near a fire leaves you burned. He insists he is no longer the dictator who tore her life apart, but a fractured man will always rewrite history to cast himself as the hero. The life lesson here is harsh but deeply necessary. A poetic apology that is never backed by real behavioral change is just a fresh coat of paint on a very old cage. "I know I must earn your trust back," he whispers. He times every pause to make his performance feel raw. His jaw tightens, playing a broken hand and fighting an inner war. He says she might decide he is not worth the pain, and he will accept. He hands her the illusion of supremacy. For a woman starved of choice, this is an intoxicating poison. He promises to accept whatever arrangement she endures. Then comes the fatal blow. "You are not just a room in my house," he rasps. "You were the reason the house had any meaning." It breaks your heart until you remember a vital life lesson. Being worshipped as a rare possession is never the same thing as being genuinely loved. The wind rattles the branches, and in that freezing silence, her trauma bond locks firmly back into place. Let us pause the camera right here and examine the ruin they have made. We see Julia in harsh lighting, staring down a man built for violence. He is an apex predator, heavy with ink, who tore her reality down to the studs. Now, he stands in the ashes, genuinely confused by the collapse. She strips away every defense and plainly states the agony he caused. It was never just one mistake, but a suffocating grip he tragically mistook for devotion. He shifts his heavy shoulders, quietly repeating that he knows, but she demands the raw truth. Finally, this untouchable king drops his hands and whispers his own terror into the cold air. The life lesson de learns to take away from is perfectly clear. True affection does not require a ransom, and love should never feel like a hostage situation. Look closely at the irony flooding this frame. The terrifying man in the city stands completely exposed and openly confessing a fear he has swallowed for 20 years. He is handing her the blade to his own throat, all because she did something unreal. When she pushes him on this terror, the camera slowly lingers on his fractured expression. His answer is pure agony. He is terrified he will ruin her again. He knows his mind is wired to rigidly control rather than to actually trust. She holds his gaze, seeing the permanent fractures in his soul. It is a devastating image, a classic tragedy, unfolding right in front of us.
The hard truth you and I must always face is that acknowledging your darkest flaws without doing the work to fix them isn't simply booking the time and place for your next disaster.
She offers him a fragile sliver of grace, acknowledging his rare self-awareness. He quietly nods, understanding that awareness is just a shadow, not a cure. But the universe has a cruel sense of timing. Deep inside her, the baby rolls. It is a primal reaction to the low rumbling bass of his father. Without thinking, she breathes out that the child moves whenever he speaks. That sentence is a fatal blow. The untouchable kingpin freezes dead in his tracks. Decades of violent, hardened armor melt into the freezing air. The camera catches his dark eyes dropping to her stomach, utterly broken by a reality he cannot fight. The lesson here is quiet but incredibly heavy. Your body will always betray your mind, speaking the brutal truth long after you have built a perfect fortress of lies. Watching a man who commands life and death suddenly beg for permission is a truly haunting piece of cinema. He breathes a question he cannot even finish. She sees the raw panic in his eyes and gently guides his hand. Think about the stark visual contrast in this shot. Those violent, scarred knuckles, knuckles resting against the very center of her life. They stand frozen in the winter light, and the baby kicks again. The crime overlord shuts his eyes, exhaling a ragged breath, completely paralyzed by something so small. He murmurs about the child being blind to dark irony of his own destructive power. The truth here is fundamental to the human experience. Real strength has nothing to do with the damage you can inflict. It is found entirely in the restraint you show when holding absolute power. Let us step back together and watch this beautiful, doomed moment unfold. He looks at her, stripped of all her defensive armor, and struggles for words. She begs him to stop, her tired heart turning against her cold logic. He promises not to push, his chest heaving, but he drops the match anyway. He calls her the single most vital piece of his existence, a truth he choked down for 2 years. As the director of your own life, you want to scream at her to run away from this cycle. Instead, she overrides her own survival instinct, pressing her forehead against the chest of the monster who broke her. The hardest pill to swallow in this life is painfully simple. You can feel deep sorrow for the one who broke you, but letting that empathy override your survival is a fatal error. Focus closely on the physical space between them right now. This is not some sweeping, romantic embrace. The camera shows 2 exhausted human beings leaning against each other because the weight of the world is just too heavy. He is terrified to even hold her, and standing as stiff a soldier with a live grenade, stroking her spine exactly once. When she finally steps back, the cold armor slides right back over her eyes. She straightens her coat, declaring she is returning to Turin. He takes the brutal hit in silence. Yet she leaves the door cracked, whispering she might consider Milan. The cold reality of this scene hits hard. Genuine healing requires real physical space. If you stay anchored to the exact source of your suffering, you will simply keep bleeding out until there is nothing left to save. You and I must pause here and look at this massive shift in the power dynamic. Matteo is playing a totally different game now. When his terrifying control tactics fail, he instantly changes his strategy. He offers to fund whatever she needs, perfectly dressing his mob desperation up as gentle kindness. He is still moving the chess pieces, but now he does it with a soft, careful voice. She wisely holds the line. She escapes to Turin, taking a quiet 4th-floor walk-up just to hear her own thoughts again. It is a brilliant masterstroke of survival. The life lesson here is written in stone. Real peace will never be neatly gift-wrapped by the person who locked you in a cage. You have to walk away and build your own quiet sanctuary with your bare hands, far from their reach. The scene opens on her packing up a temporary life, fueled by heavy wine and agonizing mental clarity. She hits 30 weeks get measurable clearance and decides to play a wildly dangerous hand against the syndicate. She puts Matteo on a total blackout. The only scrap she feeds him is one picture of a sunlit nursery. It is a brilliant surgical strike. His reaction is a shattered reflection of his massive ego. He replies with a single curse. The man is completely unraveling because he can no longer manage his own legacy. She stares at the glowing screen, sees the deep cracks in his iron facade, and quietly begins searching for an apartment in his territory. The reality here is deadly. The absolute silence is the sharpest knife you can wield against someone who demands total control. The camera pans across a beautiful flat in the Navigli district. High ceilings, worn vintage tiles, and pools of warm morning light. It is the visual opposite of his cold, fortified mafia compound. When she drops those news that she is moving to Milan, you can see the panic flash across Flaface's face. He calculates this at timing, realizing she waited until her 34th week, the final medical window for travel. His gangster reflex in, ready to command his soldiers to move her, but he catches himself, swallowing the dark order and offering it as a soft suggestion instead. Brie, he asked to sweep the perimeter. She shuts him down instantly. The lesson is undeniable. When you are putting pieces of your life back together, you must defend your new border like an absolute warrior. Now, The psychological tension reaches a boiling point. She casually corners him about Valentina, the woman lingering at the gate. Watch his body language instantly shift into defense mode. He hesitates, carefully crafting his response, admitting a past, but swearing he cut the ties. For a man with a god complex, admitting a mistake is huge. But her trauma has forged her into a human lie detector. She instantly links Valentina to the recent syndicate attacks. The dead silence over the phone line is absolute cinematic perfection. He is entirely paralyzed by the fact that she connected the invisible dots. The hard truth to carry with you is this: you must never underestimate the razor sharp sitting on to how to study your toxic patterns every single day just to stay alive. She coldly reminds him of her roots. She is a bookkeeper's daughter, her mind built to track numbers and broken patterns. Cornered, Matteo finally spills the ugly reality. Valentina was the rat selling out his security schedules. He drops a chilling line about Valentina no longer being an issue, which is standard mob speak for a permanent grave. When Julia attacks him for the endless lies, he instinctively weaponizes his own guilt, turning it around and blaming her for walking away. She snaps back, calling herself his former wife, but he smoothly slides the knife in, pointing out the divorce papers remain completely unsigned. The life lesson here cuts incredibly deep. Keeping dark secrets under the disguise of protecting someone is almost always a selfish lie used to guard your own comfort. Stick with me as we examine this final, brutal frame together. She blinks, completely blindsided by his cold logic. Her lawyer filed an extension, meaning she secretly stalled the final blow herself. She whispers her dark confession. She has not signed them. The silence that drops between them is suffocating, heavy with the gravity of their tragic, magnetic codependency. The scene immediately cut to its freezing December morning. She is 32 weeks along, watching his science soldiers carry her boxes into the new flat. They call her Sonora, eyes locked respectfully on the floor. The profound lesson hidden in this quiet scene is absolutely heartbreaking. Sometimes we stall our own great escape, leaving the back door wide open and germs littered. The monster we are fleeing magically transforms us into a saint. Midday light spills across a soft grey rug, illuminating the white dresser and a tiny baby mobile swaying in the quiet draft. His silent crew has vanished, leaving behind her brand new sanctuary. Let us look at this room together, you and I. This is not his heavily guarded compound. This is a bright monument to her independence. The rush of true safety finally washes over her. Feeling empowered, she texts a invitation for lunch. Within seconds, his reply flashes on the glass. He insists on bringing the food himself, a desperate attempt to disguise his obsessive control as gentle care. The tragedy is plain to see. Taking total ownership of your own physical space is always the mandatory first to ripping your soul back from the hands of the very man who broke it. The camera lingers on her chest, rising and falling as she breathes in real, unfiltered air. 7 weeks until the baby comes. But the quiet shatters at noon. The heavy door swings open, framing the big bad wolf. His dark coat hangs loose, sleeves rolled down to hide the venomous ink scarring his neck. In his lethal hands, he carries takeout from a tiny spot she mentioned 18 months ago. Men obsessed with power never forget a detail if it buys them loyalty. He steps over the threshold, and in 3 silent seconds, his dark eyes scan the shadows, checking sightlines, mentally mapping every single exit. It breaks your heart to watch. People rarely shed their deep, violent survival instincts. They simply changed the lighting of the rooms where they choose to deploy them. The tension drains from his rigid shoulders the moment his paranoid mind confirms no killers are waiting in the dark corners. The most dangerous man in the city stops dead in front of her delicate white dresser, his lethal hands burying themselves deep in his coat pockets. "It is good," he whispers, the sound barely scraping the thin walls. "I know." She fires back, her chin lift she claims as her newfound power. For a second, his mouth twitches into a tired smile. They sit at her cheap table, eating absurdly expensive food, trading baby names like rival warlords dividing up city blocks. It reminds us of a simple truth. Real equality only breathes when two bruised people. Bruce 8 can finally sit from me when no one holds the key to lock the door. The lighting shifts in the cramped room, casting harsh shadows across his scarred face. He watches her with that terrifying, unblinking focus he usually observes of dismantling rival bloodlines. He counters her baby names with his own, turning a hostage dynamic into a quiet standoff. But as the empty plates are pushed aside, the air in the room turns to ice. "I need to tell you something," she says, her voice trembling slightly. She confesses her escape last January was not just a tactical retreat. It was far darker. This is where the tragedy truly sinks its teeth in. Running blindly into the night is a completely useless move, unless you turn around and face the absolute terror of why you let yourself die in the dark for so long. "Stay with me." This is where the story truly breaks your heart. The camera pushes in close on her face, facing. She stares down at her trembling hands, confessing the sickest secret of their bond. She never just ran from his violent empire. She ran because the sheer weight of her love for a monster horrified her. Imagine the torture of adoring a ruthless king. Knowing you are just a fading ghost in his massive shadow, she fled to see if her mind was still her own. And now, she says as holding his cold, predatory gaze, "I am choosing." Think about the heavy gravity of those words. The ultimate ray tragedy of the human heart is that love means absolutely nothing at all unless you can easily walk out the open door, and you choose to stay in the burning room anyway. The silence in that cramped kitchen becomes so dense it physically chokes the air. Slowly, his massive, ink-stained hand slides across scratched wood and covers hers. It is not a trap. It is not the violent grip of a warlord claiming a stolen prize. It is completely gentle. "Julia," he whispers, the syllables catching in his throat without a single trace of a threat. "I know we cannot go back," she warns, drawing a line in the wet sand. "Neither am I," he replies. "I want something new." She flips her hand over, pressing her bare palm against his scars, demanding the one thing he has never surrendered: absolute honesty. We all need to remember this painful lesson. You can never rebuild a shattered life if you insist on using the exact same broken bricks. The lens captures the exact moment she dismantles his entire empire of fear. She lays out the new laws of their fragile universe. No making choices for her. No acting like a prison warden and dressing it up as romance. She orders him to sit quietly in a room with her, without trying to hack her mind. "That will be the hardest one," he admits. His thumb traces her knuckles, a fading ghost of the possessive monster he was born to be. Then the unbreakable kingpin shatters. "Yes, to all of it," he says, his voice thick with defeat. I am not negotiating, I am agreeing. It is enough to make a stone weep. The hardest lesson is the way someone who holds absolute power finally drops their weapons. That is the only real proof of change. Everything else is just a patient trap. Let us pause and rewind the film for a second. You and I fade in on the bitter cold of early January. She had been free for a full year, surviving on nothing but raw nerve. But the trauma fractures her body, and she goes into labor 2 weeks early. In a blind panic, she dials the monster. He arrives in exactly 11 minutes. The math of that drive from his estate is utterly impossible. He was out there in the freezing rain, Mesmer circling her block like a starving shark, calling his sick obsession a form of protection. It is terrifying, yet profoundly heartbreaking. We all have to learn this the hard way in life. Someone standing right outside your front door does not mean you are safe. Sometimes, the fiercely loyal guard dog is actually the hungry wolf waiting to strike. The moment she rips open that apartment door, the camera catches a ruthless killer completely losing his grip on reality. His heavy wool coat hangs open, sleeves shoved up to expose every violent vow inked into his skin. He tries to lock his jaw, but his dark eyes are blown wide with sheer panic. He does not bark a single command. He simply offers his steady arm, shifting from a man who forces her hand to a man begging her to choose him. The rest of that hospital night bleeds into a frantic blur of agony. She screams, caught between her crying best friend and the mob boss crushing her other hand. It strips the soul raw to realize the truth. Sometimes we only survive our darkest, most violent nightmares by desperately grabbing the hand of the devil himself. Under the harsh hospital glare, the violently controlling man usually fractures into pieces. He would threaten surgeons just to feel like a god again. But this kingpin breaks every rule of his own dark nature. He draws no weapons. He screams at no nurses. He stands froze, just then rooted exactly where she ordered him to stay. When the blinding agony of labor tears down her final walls, he does not posture as the alpha. He simply leans into the sweat on her forehead, whispering that she is the bravest soul he has ever witnessed. As the pale sun breaks the Wednesday horizon, their son takes his first breath. Real, lasting change never kicks the door down to announce itself. It sneaks up in the quiet, shocking choice to finally close your mouth and listen. The camera pushes in tight for the emotional climax. The newborn lets out a sharp, furious cry that cuts through the sterile room. As the undisputed king of the underworld finally reaches out to take his son, his terrifying aura simply evaporates into thin air. He presses this fragile, screaming life directly against his chest, right over the brutal black ink that defines his bloody legacy. The heavy armor falls to the floor. His face is stripped bare, wet with unedged tears. He whispers to the boy that he will do better, a desperate, bleeding promise made to the cold universe. It proves a beautifully tragic fact about our humanity. The raw instinct to shield our own blood can literally rewrite our broken brains, granting us one final shot at redemption. She watches him from the hospital bed, her eyes narrowed with the paranoid stare of a soldier surviving a long, brutal war. She reads the violence tattooed on his skin, but even she can see the fatal glitch in his armor. 2 days later, they walk out into the cold air, but the mobster does not drive them to his heavily armed fortress. He steers the car to her tiny apartment. A warlord willingly abandoning his castle is the ultimate surrender. He brews her coffee, then stands silently against the wall, staring at a fragile new life he is not quite allowed to touch. It is a cinematic gut punch that leaves you breathless. The only way to truly love a broken survivor is to sit quietly outside the massive stone walls they built and simply wait for an invitation. Let us look at this piece by Shupi, shall we? The camera lingers as the unthinkable unfolds. This man of violence, forged in blood, supposed to walk out the door. It is a flawless tactical retreat, surrendering the keys to her freedom. Yet the moment she softly asks him to stay for dinner, his hardened mask shatters. He accepts instantly, quietly desperate. They eat in a glass brittle silence. Then comes the true twist. She simply falls asleep, sleeps. Her exhausted body no longer registers him as a predator. The shadows deepen as he drapes a blanket over her, watching her breathe before fading into the night. On the table sits Trino trying to rewrite their tragic history. Intimacies is never magic. It is built brick by agonizing brick. In those terrifying moments, we choose to stay. The morning light catches the handwritten note he left behind. He promises to wait. Over the following weeks, this brutal enforcer shows a terrifying restraint. He refused to cross her threshold without a spoken invitation. Watch Julia's eyes dart toward him. Her traumatized mind braces for the moment the monster breaks from his cage, but the violent snap never comes. Instead, she watches an apex predator slowly pull out his own fangs. The lies stop entirely. The camera closes in on his scarred hands cradling their son with a devotion so delicate it draws heavy tears from her eyes. It forces us to face a hard reality about human connection. You can never extract trust through fear or force. True loyalty is only ever earned by showing up, day after day, with nothing but empty hands. Observe the quiet shift in his daily movements. He silently anticipates her needs, entirely done with barking orders. 6 weeks pass in this quiet purgatory before Julia reaches a massive emotional pivot. She dials Ferrant, the sweating lawyer from Act 1, telling him to halt the divorce. The camera holds on the lawyer as he freezes. He realizes the twisted truth. She is willingly choosing the fire. The power dynamic has completely inverted. She is no longer the captive. The iron keys rest solely in her palm. Ferrante sighs, feeding the documents into a shredder like a man exhausted by endless mafia tragedies. The life lesson here is profoundly clear. Forgiveness is never a magic spell to wash away the blood. It is merely the terrifying choice to drop your heavy armor and wait. She chooses a quiet Sunday to hand him the shredded legal documents. The director strips away the score entirely. There is no music, only the baby breathing softly as heavy shadows bleed across the room. When Matteo scans the ruined papers, Julia warns him not to mistake this for a victory. Then comes the shock. He actually agrees. He openly admits he is still on trial. Confessing his violent history earned him nothing. Watching a man built on ruthless ego finally swallow his pride is staggering. She whispers, asking him to step closer. He stops just outside her reach. The gang ink was in his throat, exposed under the lights. Here's the lessons. True power is never about being untouchable. It is about staring directly at the monster who broke you and realizing your fear is gone. The camera pushes tight as she reaches past his tilted suit and prison ink, pressing her bare palm against his chest. Her gaze cuts straight through him to lay down the final boundary. The bloody slate remains stained, but she is choosing the broken man before her. Matteo traps her hand against his heart, the frantic hammering of his ribs vibrating off the screen. He swears to spend his life proving his rebirth. The kiss that follows is a masterclass in cinematic restraint. It is not the toxic collision from the first act. It is painfully slow.
Anchored by the crushing weight of genuine trust, we often misunderstand forgiveness. The truth that healing never demands. We pretend the monster was a myth.
It simply means the monster has finally learned how to bleed. Let us unpack this scene together. The director draws strict invisible lines here. Julia retains absolute sovereignty. Her apartment is a fortress, and the ruthless crime boss is just a guest. Astonishingly, he accepts this surrender without flinching. Suddenly, a wail from the baby monitor slices the silence. Matteo does not march into the nursery. He freezes. His massive team stands completely still, waiting for Julia to grant a single nod of permission. Only then does this terrifying killer lift his son with absolute gentleness. The untouchable kingpin who once burned cities is now entirely at the mercy of a crying infant. It is a brilliant irony that mirrors our own reality. The strongest, most unbreakable chains we will ever wear in this life are always the ones we willingly ask for. The frame isolates Julia against a massive window staring down at the frozen streets of Milan. The city outside is blind to the psychological warfare that Juzzard concluded above it. Stick with me here, because the subtext is magnificent. She is not trying to glue the shattered shards of a poisoned marriage back together. She is pouring thick concrete for an entirely new fortress. Somehow, she managed to rewire the predatory instincts of a crime boss. She faces this terrifying chapter with the ice-cold focuses of a survivor who crawled out of the dark. As the camera pulls back, it leaves us with a vital truth. You cannot save a doomed house by slapping fresh paint over rotting timber. You survive by tearing it down to the dirt and building new walls that know exactly how to take a hard hit. Let this final shot sink in. It is the ultimate cinematic punchline. Study the amber light bleeding into the nursery. A mob boss who spent decades making men tremble is now paralyzed by the fragile weight of a sleeping infant. Across the shadows stands Julia. Armed with nothing, she has completely rewired a megalomaniac's universe. His sacred code of mafia loyalty has morphed into a beautiful, inescapable trap. The film closes on one last piercing truth. Real power is never measured by the people you can destroy, but by the one you finally surrender your heart to. Thank you for stepping into the dark with me today. If this breakdown left a mark, hit subscribe and drop your theories below. Did you see his shift coming, or was the shadow too deep? I will see you in the next frame.